It's been a while since I've spoken in detail about the idea of polycultures and guilds, and so in this video I'd like to do an early spring wander looking at tree, shrub, herbaceous plant relationships in a landscape, and especially looking at temporal relationships, those things that are young and just getting going, long-term horizon successional plans, and working with the passing of elders. I'll start by looking at this being right here. So this is the skeleton or the passed away body of an old sweet cherry. This was in the landscape when my folks first purchased this property in 2008. So it's been around, it was alive then and passing away. It was really winding down. It'd probably been here for a long time. We enjoyed some cherries from this tree. We planted some seeds in new spots. It planted itself in new spots. And rather than cutting it flush to ground, it was cut, it's underneath the power lines, and it was going to hurt the power lines if it eventually, or when it eventually pulled apart. So we had the line crew cut it, but nice and high. And this has turned into a really beautiful habitat for lots of little creatures. Birds come and go, bees live in the crevices, pileated woodpeckers come and visit it. But the point is, here is an old being in the landscape, and so what happens around this? And a great default, whether there's an old tree in the landscape that's alive or passing or somewhere in between, black currants are pretty much a great universal, like sure, pop them in. If the cherry was still actively growing, they'd be competent and comfortable with the shade. When the cherry passed away and the root system starts to be digested by the earth, the black currants with their really hungry, really shallow root systems will scoop it all up and turn it into delicious food and medicine. And you can see some other characters in here that work nicely as well. Solomon seal, extremely competent and comfortable herbaceous being. We haven't worked with them as a food, although we've been told it is a nice food. But you can see right in there, tucked in amongst the black currant. Every once in a while in the early spring, we just harvest extra cuttings from the black currant to liberate light for this friend. And that seems to work out pretty nicely. So there's this old cherry that has passed away and some new affirming directions in the landscape. But those are all cane and herbaceous layers. So let's talk about the tree layer. Here is a grafted pear from my dear friend Akiva. I won't pretend to say the name. It's a Ukrainian name, starts with a K, Krasulia. It's supposed to be an incredibly high quality, rare, ancient, hardy pear. And it sure seems that way. We've got a ring around it for the occasional deer that still move through this landscape. But this will be the future successional being in this space, or one of the key successional canopy elements. And we've got here gumi in peak flower, beautiful smelling, beautiful looking gumi flower, providing nectar flow for the bees. This is a nitrogen fixer. It's in a lower position to the pear. It's to the west of the pear, so this is to the south and a little east of the gumi. There is comfrey underneath here doing the dynamic accumulation work. It's drawing nutrients up. We can cut and feed that to the pear, or cut that, feed it to somebody else that seems as though they need it. The gumi certainly doesn't. And then to the north of all this, we'll see how this works out, but this is an English walnut. It's got some issues. I imagine this being passing away, and that'll be all right if that's true. But that's there as a super canopy, a nice super tall, and as long as it's to the north of this pear, we can always prune the branches to allow more light to that. So that's a fair bit going on around what used to be under the canopy of an old grandma sweet cherry, and their body parts from down below, all the root system. So the volume of this tree was met and exceeded by the volume of the roots down below, and all of that slowly, steadily becoming soil. And so having all these other trees in here really helps take all that nutrient that the cherry accumulated and convert it back into new beings. Here's a seedling apple that we have just growing along. Pop that in. We'll give that another 9 years or so to see what the fruit is like and decide if we want to graft it or leave it. Probably we'll leave it. There's a shagbark hickory that a squirrel planted the same year as I planted a northern pecan. So these two will be to the north of this whole scene. They're the northernmost element in this particular glade, and they can pollinate each other, and the seeds can have the potential of a mixture between pecan and shagbark hickory. Believe it or not, there's a lot more in here, but I'll just leave it at that as this one particular complex guild, a little thicket, let's call it. Maybe it's roughly 30 feet by 20 feet or so in that area. A lot going on. There's more trees, there's more herbaceous elements, but let's move on to another set of plant relationships. Here's one that I really like, and that is in a peak moment, although yesterday before the rain it was even quite a bit nicer. This is Siberian Peach, which is a plant we offer through our website. It's a somewhat dwarfing peach form. I haven't pruned this at all, and I'm content with the size that it is. It makes peaches that are particularly thick-skinned and hard, which most people would say you don't want that, but that allows me to shake the tree and harvest the fruit from the ground and let it ripen on the counter. So it's actually ideal, and I can let this go wherever it wants to grow and do its thing. So this is obviously the keystone element in here. It's not a huge tree, but a nice sized tree. It has, as a cane layer below, a red currant you can see coming into peak flower. So the currants and the peaches overlap in their flowering time, so the bees that come in get to have two nice browse windows. And then right now it's extremely subdued, but this is the stalk of river locust, or Amorpha fruticosa, co-planted just to the south of the peach, which helps prevent sun scald as it leaves out during the summer. I just cut that very, very hard this spring because I could see the peach was ready to do a pretty serious amount of flowering and potential fruit production. So I wanted to liberate as much nitrogen to the peach as possible for this year. And certainly this river locust will re-sprout and fill in. It'll do so after the currants have made their fruit. And so it'll confer a little bit of shade to the currants during the heat of the summer, which the currants will appreciate. And it should all work just fine. The herbaceous layer down in here has young purple asparagus starting. That's to the south of all of this. You can see a few here popping up. And then in and amongst, driven over by my electric riding mower, oh well, but I think they'll be okay, are strawberries. I didn't mean to drive on them, but that's what you get when in the winter you forget about gardens and you throw a bunch of wood. So normally I can be over here, but I had stuff to haul. So very thoroughly soil to plant contacted strawberries, we'll say it that way. Under here, I'm sure the runners will be fine, and I'll move the lumber. But so we've got running ground cover in the form of ever-bearing strawberries, and dynamic accumulator and food-bearing layer in the asparagus, with the nitrogen-fixing shrub layer, chop and droppable river locust in the mix of all this, some currants, and then our keystone of the Siberian peach. And that's all happening in a circle that is about 8 feet in diameter or so. That second guild relationship there was one that was all established at once from a lawn context. But I'd like to return again to the idea of looking at succession in the form of trees passing and new trees coming up into canopy, successional swapping, so to speak. But pretty close to the house. This was back in 2008, 2009 when my folks were first here. There were two white pines. There's a stump here and a stump there that were starting to pass away and lean over. You can imagine the canopy of those pines leaning slightly towards the house with decaying trunks. It wasn't a great fit, so they were cut down. We actually milled up all that wood and used it for all sorts of projects back in the day. And then the tops were woven into the brush wall, certainly broken down into soil by now. But here are these two old trees, and rather than bringing an excavator out and ripping the roots, how do we get rid of all that stuff, shred it up, so we can finally get something else happening? We just left the stumps there and planted next to them. So for example, I found a space in the root flare to the south and put in this chestnut tree. Chestnut had absolutely no problem finding soil down in between the roots of the pine, and now it certainly is eating the remaining bits of pine root that are down there. And you can only imagine that if this is what it's like on the top of the pine, so we didn't add soil, this is what the tree is becoming. You can even see annual seedlings in here. This has passed away enough that I could probably bowl this out with just a soil knife, put a little bit of compost, and grow a squash out of here. So clearly the trees are able to get what they need too. Chestnut is growing up and up and up, and in fact I plan to cut these bigger branch sets off and select the chestnut to be more of a timber form, since this is quintessentially a tree where we only need to get the nuts off the ground. We never need to climb this tree. This is one who can go up and up and up and do just fine. You can see the mistake I made in the past of allowing a hardy kiwi to grow through the chestnut. That has been reduced, and so we'll trellis the kiwi lower, and removing those branches will help it be harder for the kiwi to climb up. And then in the shade of the chestnut, a little to the south, are some pawpaws. So here's one and here's another one. Another plant being that we can just pick the fruit up off the ground, so I'm not worried about how tall they get. So pawpaw underneath the shade of a chestnut on its way towards real canopy scenario, and the chestnut should be a stable, strong, shade-producing plant for the home, all next to a dying and decaying trunk. And this one's quite a bit more complex. This was a larger pine tree, but the same exact picture happened directly next to the pine. I found a root flare space, basically the year this was cut, and I put in a Chickasaw plum. So this is a thicket-forming, suckering, super hardy plum. Doesn't make a lot of fruit because it needs more pollinator support in here and more plums that overlap closer to it. But beautiful. I mean, it's just, the aroma is amazing right now. And so tons and tons of beautiful flowers. A very functional plant, very hardy. You can see there's some tulips and things under here growing. There's some wooden tulips and some other tulips. This is my father's ash location here, where we have an oak planted for him. You can see that little sweet Ashworth bur oak with a gumi supporting. Very, very young installation there. But this is the next layer of succession, that there's the plum doing its work, and then eventually an oak will come into here with the gumi, like I showed with the pear, doing its work. Arc of successional things happening here. This was a peach that was full canopy, really occupying a lot of this space. In fact, you can see the gap in here is basically all of this area. And a number of years ago, we started to see gummosis and disease on the peach. So I put a pawpaw to the north of that peach, which slowly grew. You can see it was leaning out away from the peach. And this last year, we finally cut the peach because it was ready to go. And now the pawpaw can become the canopy element in here and work just fine. This is a complex enough guild as it is. Lots of relationships, both temporal and physical, happening. But then to add more complexity, a squirrel put a shagbark hickory nut here, probably around 8 or 9 years ago, right next to a tulip. And the shagbark slowly and steadily, like a little rocket ship, went straight up through the plum. I pruned the branches away from the plum periodically to make room for it. And now this hickory is on its way. And now it's fully up above everybody, and it can do the continued rocket ship game of just going up and putting out giant, beautiful, deep shade through most of the summer. And so it's the perfect space to have late day shade being cast onto this home around peak summer solstice and beyond when we need it. So thanks, squirrel. That was a design element I didn't think of, and I'm really happy that that's there. So we've got native plum, a native hickory, a native oak, a non-native gumi hanging out in here with some native pawpaw. So nice medley. And my pops is in there to grow as an oak in his next life. There are a lot more of these kinds of complex relationships in the landscape, but that's all I've got for capacity this morning. I'll try to make some time early morning or in the evenings just to look through at more of these. I really enjoy this, and it feels like a lot of folks enjoy it as well. So let's have some comments down below, questions or concerns around these plant relationships in particular, or suggestions, different things you're experimenting with as far as plants near one another, both physically and then time partitioning wise, how that's working for you. Hoping that wherever you are, you're surrounded by really complex and diverse relationships, that the yields might be happening a little bit later than you'd expect, and that's all right.